Thank you, everyone, for joining us for week 2. We are going to talk about the other histories that are going on at the same time as the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible is discussing the time of the monarchy, the kings. Last time we went way back to about 170,000 BC. This time, not quite so far back. We came up last week to about the time of the patriarchs, and this time we're going to be talking about around the time of the monarchy. That is the establishment of the monarchy under Saul, and then of course David and Solomon and Rehoboam, and after that. So where we're going to start is the founding of a settlement, a city called Alba Longa. Alba Longa will become the leading city of what will be known as the Latin League. This is about the year, probably about the year 1100. Well, actually, probably about the year 1180 BC. And Alba Longa will eventually be absorbed by what comes to be known as Rome. Alba Longa was legendarily established by Aeneas, who was a warrior who had survived, a refugee who had survived the sack of Troy, and that was about 1184 BC. So Aeneas, his family, and others come and establish this. And it's the beginning of the Latins in Italy. There were Etruscans, to be sure, but the Latins will grow and grow and grow in power and eventually become the Roman Empire, but not for a while. So image 1, in 1100 BC, there arose a character named Zoroaster. That's what the Greeks called him. Actually, I just forgot to tell that one. Let's go back there. Here is a quick look at the Africa, Australia, and Eurasia, and all the cultures that had already developed around the year 1000 BC. It's not that there are few people in the world. Nope, there are lots and lots of people and lots of cultures that are developing. I mean, these are remarkable cultures. The Bantu people, who are in what would today be called like the Congo, the Republic of the Congo, and Kenya, Somalia, Tanzania, Uganda, all down in Africa. In Ethiopia, you see the Cushites that have developed. They're in the eastern horn of Africa there. Egypt, we know about. The Indo-Aryans we had talked about, who had come down from Central Europe and made their way through Persia, where you see the Iranian pastoral peoples, and then down into the Indus River Valley of India. There's cultures in Japan, in Korea, in Siberia, the far reaches of Siberia, as well as all the islands of Micronesia and Australia and Indonesia. Humans are to be found everywhere by this time. There's really no place that you're not going to find humans. And this is just the Eastern Hemisphere. If we were to look over in the Western Hemisphere, we would see cultures that were thriving very well, flourishing in the Americas, North and South and Central America. So if we go then to the next image, image 1, around 1100 BC, we see a guy named Zoroaster, as he's commonly called now. In his language, Avestan, he was called Zarathustra. That's when this guy appears, and he's said to have been the first philosopher. This language that you see up here is Avestan, and it is a language that is going to have a huge influence on languages like Arabic. And if we were to compare an Arabic script with it, you would see just how close that really is. Anyway, so Zarathustra is, he's been called not only the first philosopher, but he's called the father of ethics. He's the first rationalist, and he's one of the first monotheists. And he's the first one to really start talking about notions of heaven and hell, judgment after death, and free will, something that did not begin with John Stuart Mill or any of those guys. Nope, this has been talked about for a long time. In the second image, or the next image, in 1089, a guy named Melanthus becomes the legendary king of Athens. He finally dies after a 37-year reign, they said, and he is succeeded by his son Codrus. There is the Aegean Sea. You can see Troy, pardon me, which of course had been sacked by the combined forces of the Greeks. There is Athens, and Mycenae is just to the southwest of that. Mycenae is going to be one of the early cultures of Greece. It will have some of the first, I told you about this last week, identifiable architectural style, the post and lintel. And then farther down, you'll see Sparta. Sparta will play a big role much later on. Knossos, down there on the island of Crete, we talked about that last time, that it had actually been, at one time, a thriving city of 80,000 people, but it was eventually destroyed by earthquake and tidal wave and all like that. So now in 1069, Ramses the 11th passes away, and sorry about that. And that ends the 20th dynasty of Egypt. He is succeeded by Smendes I, who is the founder of the 21st dynasty. The Egyptian history is broken up into the families, the dynasties. You know, the 5th dynasty was called the pyramid builders. The 18th dynasty was the great warriors and builders like Ramses II. Now, in 1068, the next year, after Ramses dies, Codrus dies in battle against Dorian invaders after he had reigned for 21 years. The Athenian tradition considers him to be the last king to have absolute power. Modern historians consider him to be the last king whose life account is actually a part of Greek mythology. The reason we say that he is the last absolute king is because even then, as early as 1048 BC, I'm sorry, 1068 BC, we're starting to see the beginnings of Athenian democracy start to develop. It won't get full blown for several hundred years or a few hundred years yet, but after this, they start developing what can really be called like a parliamentary system of government, a democratic system of government. He is succeeded, Codrus, by his son Medon. In 1050, the Philistine cities, Ashkelon, Ekron, Ashdod, those cities on the coast of Israel, what we would call Israel today, the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, now we're starting to hear things that we know about. In 1100, the Philistines had started to really rise to power, but now in the time of the Judges, the book of Judges, think of that, the Philistines have captured the Ark of the Covenant. They actually move the Ark over into one of their Philistine cities, and if you remember reading in the book of Judges, they talk about putting the ark almost like as a tribute into the temple of their god Dagon. Dagon was a fish god, and one of my favorite jokes ever is that they must have called him Cod Almighty. Yeah, okay. Anyway, so now in the temple of Dagon, the Ark of the Covenant now rests there. And during this time, we start to see no longer a judge. He becomes one of Israel's first prophets. In fact, technically Israel's first prophet. And that, of course, is Samuel. Samuel had been in sort of, what do I want to say, acting as a judge. And now, since the people are starting to want a king, then Samuel will transition from judge to prophet. Now, only 2 years later, Medon, the king of Athens that we had talked about, he dies after a 20-year reign and is succeeded by his son, Acastus. Acastus nor Medon will have that absolute power that we were talking about before. Now, what's happening in the rest of the world? Way over, look at image 3, way over in 1046, just a couple of years after the death of Medon, we see the beginnings of the Chao dynasty. Now, that's, oops, sorry, not that one. Oh, I forgot to mention that. Well, there you see the cities of the Philistines: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Akron, Gath. Remember, Gath is where Goliath was said to have come from. Yeah, and Jerusalem is way over there. And Jericho, remember we talked last time, was actually an ancient city. Not quite as old as Damascus, but still one of the longest continually inhabited cities of the ancient world. So then on to the next one. And that is the Chao dynasty. Now, it's ZH, and to us it looks like Zhao, but in Chinese pronunciation, it's kind of given a CH sound, Chao. The Chao dynasty begins here in 1046 with King Wu. Nice name. He overthrows the last of the Shang dynasty kings, whose name was Di Jin, and becomes the first king of the Chao dynasty, which will last for, oh goodness, almost 800 years. Well, technically 790 years. And this was this Chao dynasty was actually founded by Wu's father, Wen. There won't be a quiz on this. So first comes Wen, then comes Wu. Fill in your own jokes here. So now, this is what's going on, and you can see how large the Chao dynasty empire is in China. It doesn't have all of China, no, but this is the huge chunk that it is. In fact, it would include today what would be the cities of Beijing, Shanghai, at the Yellow River, the Yangtze River are all part of this very, very fertile, very, very advanced civilization. Remember, writing is taking place here already. They have their characters, their kanji that is developing, and for almost 800 years, the Chaos will propel China into a remarkable kingdom and empire. So back over around the same time as King Wu, who followed King Wen, around this same time in 1044 is the death of Smendes, the king of Egypt. When he died, he is succeeded by 2 co-regents. Why? Because his heir is very, very young. Those 2 regents, you don't even know them, but they're Susenes the first and Neferkari Amenensu. Now, around the same time, King Chang, sorry, of the Chao succeeds Wu and becomes the next great ruler. Then back over to Egypt, one of the two regents, Neferkari, Amenemhotep, winds up dying, leaving sole power with Susanes the first. At this time, we have over in Israel, finally, the establishment of the monarchy in Israel. King Saul becomes the first king of the Israelites in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which in the Hebrew Bible is just called the book of Samuel. There's no 1st and 2nd according to the Hebrew Bible. Same way with Kings and Chronicles, no 1st and 2nd, just the book of the Kings, the book of the Chronicles, and the books of Samuel, book of Samuel. So now back over in China, they have another king has died by 1020. In Athens, a new king, Acastus, arises, or Acastus dies and is succeeded by his son Archippus. Now, down in Africa, in what today would be Kenya, we see the first evidence of farming in what's called the Kenya Highlands. That's the beginning of true architecture, agriculture down there as well. So back up to what we would call Canaan. Look at the next image, and in the 1000s, around the around the year 1000, we see the beginning of the Phoenician alphabet. In the early Iron Age, the Phoenician alphabet was used to write the Northwest Semitic languages, especially Phoenician and Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Old Aramaic, and Hebrew. How did I forget that? When you look at this old Phoenician alphabet, you can see that there are some letters that are going to look a lot like, and I tried to create a side-by-side image and I couldn't do it, but you'll see that some of these letters have a direct bearing on some of the Hebrew letters, that is to say, the Aramaic letters that will follow after this. You see that the second to last letter before the T is the SH sound. That is almost exactly like the Hebrew letter. Oh goodness, the Aleph up on top, the one that looks like a hook, is and also looks like an early form of Hebrew. Okay, now on to the next one, and then you can see that that SH sound, the sheen down the second from the bottom, looks like the very same letter, doesn't it? That's the shush sound. Shush. Anyway, remember I told you about last time that no, I need the other one. There you go. That the early Hebrew language was written in pictograms, and these are showing some of those pictograms. The first letter, Aleph, the word or the phrase Aleph means strong, and the pictogram is an ox head, which is of course strong. Funny thing is, you look at the next letter, Beth, and that actually looks like a floor plan of a tent, and so Beth becomes house. Beth means house. That's why you'll see a lot of synagogues or temples, Jewish temples, named like Temple Bethel, House of God. Bethlehem, Jesus born in Bethlehem, it means the house of bread. Now, oddly enough, interestingly enough, when you combine those two letters, Aleph and Beth, strong and house, it becomes father. Ab is the Hebrew word for father, who is in fact, according to their traditions, the strong man of the house, the strong one of the house. And then they'll wind up having numbers attributed to all these things, like Aleph is 1, Beth is 2. And then the great thing is that when you take the numbers for father and add the numbers of all the letters, the values of the letters for mother, it is the same number of the letters for child. That's pretty fascinating. And if you were to figure up all the numbers, you remember in Revelation, you read about the 144,000. You may not remember that, but in Hebrew, 144 is the numeric value for paradise. Pretty slick. So yeah, when we're reading the book of Revelation, sometimes we really need to know our Hebrew and our Hebrew Bible pretty well. So we have now King Saul oh no, I've gone past him. The Phoenician alphabet, that's right, now leading to the Hebrew alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet in its proper what do I say structure is what is used to remain as the alphabet for use in ancient Carthage all the way up to the 2nd century BC, whereas elsewhere it winds up breaking up into different national kind of alphabets, including Aramaic and Samaritan and several Anatolian scripts from up in Asia Minor, and even the early Greek alphabets. So in Hebrew and in the Old Phoenician, you have Aleph and Beth, A and B. In Greek, we have Alpha and Beta, very closely related. And of course, that's where we get the phrase alphabet, alpha, beta. It's basically, the alphabet is, of course, the ABCs. In Greek, technically, it's ABGs, but never mind that. So now, around this time, around 1000, David will become the successor to Saul. David will establish his throne in the capital, the new capital at Jerusalem. And around this same time, over in India, India has now entered into its Iron Age, where Iron Age kingdoms will begin to rule there in Panchala and the Kuru and Kosala and Videha and Janapada states. All of these start to really develop now because of the Indo-Aryans who had invaded India several centuries before. So we move into the 10th century BC, and in 993, Amenemope, there's a good name, succeeds Susenes the first in Egypt. And Amenemope is such a, I want to mention him because he wound up writing a book of wisdom. And this book of wisdom has a very great impact on another book that we know so well, the book of Proverbs. In fact, in the book of Proverbs, an entire section is drawn from the wisdom. It's called the Wisdom of Amenemope. Now, is that to say that the Hebrews were copying the Egyptians? No, nobody thought about those things in those days. In those days, what was important was the wisdom itself. It didn't matter where the wisdom came from. It didn't matter if it was the Egyptians who said it or the Babylonians who said it. What was important was this was wise and it needed to be preserved, the Hebrews would say, for our people. We need that same kind of wisdom. The whole world needs that same kind of wisdom. So it was kind of common to see back in those days that a book like the Wisdom of Amenemope would be found in different ways all over the ancient Middle East. Now, in that same year, 993, is when Archippus, the king of Athens, dies after a reign of 19 years, and he's succeeded by his son Thersippus. In Egypt, a few years later, Orsakon the Elder Sorkon, the elder, will succeed Amenemope. And around this same time is the end of the first period of just dropped his name, Cao Yang. Cao Yang is one of the first authors of a famous Chinese book called the I Ching. May have heard of it before, but it will become kind of a spiritual guide for the ancient Chinese. In fact, there are many people to this day who still study it. In fact, of all people, C.G. Jung, the great psychologist and student of Freud, had written an introduction to a modern version of the I Ching. He was fascinated by the philosophy and the spirituality of it. So around this period, 982, the I Ching begins to take shape. In Egypt, another king has passed away. His name was Siamun, never mind that. But also about the same time, a new power begins to arise, and it's the kingdom of Assyria. Assyria is going to dominate the 700s BC. Assyria will come through Palestine, Canaan, the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. And here in 967 BC, a guy named Tiglath-Pileser II becomes the king of Assyria, and he begins looking elsewhere, begins to start moving out from the north Mesopotamian region of Assyria. In 962, the passing of King David. He dies, and his son Solomon becomes the king of Israel. Solomon wasn't the one who was expected to succeed him. It looked like it was going to be Absalom, but Absalom, of course, wound up leading a revolt against David. And in one of the very saddest episodes of the Old Testament, David is trying to be forgiving to Absalom, and Absalom is escaping, winds up getting his hair caught in a tree, a low-hanging branch, and he winds up hanging there. And in one of the most emotional scenes, when they bring the news back to David, David's response is, "Absalom, Absalom, my son, my son." Well, Solomon will wind up being the successor to King David. 962 is the traditional date for the passing of King David. Egypt will go through another king while Solomon is consolidating his power, and in 957, Solomon completes constructing Solomon's temple, the first temple in Jerusalem. Around this same time, if we can look at the next image, whatever that number may be, we'll see the beginnings of the Aramaic language. No, that's not the one I was looking for, I don't think. Oh, no, that'll work. Because you'll see there, that one, that's the one I wanted. That is the Aramaic language, and that is going to become adopted by the Hebrews, and that will be the Hebrew alphabet as well. You'll see, oh, I see how they've got it. So if you'll look at the upper right-hand side, that's the Aleph, or what we would call A. And it doesn't sound like A. We don't make that sound like that. In fact, underneath it, it says it's a silent letter. It's actually called a glottal stop. Never mind that. We'll talk about that over coffee sometime. So they are now, since they're doing it in proper Hebrew style, it begins on the top line on the far right, and you work your way from right to left. Then go to the second line from right to left. Of course, that's why most ancient, well, most modern even, Eastern languages, Arabic, Hebrew, Chinese, Japanese, is all that left to right, or right to left. Sorry. So this is now what starts to develop. Is this becomes the language, or sorry, the alphabet that we find most of the documents from the Hebrew language written in. The Old Testament writings that we have is all going to use this kind of alphabet. Pardon me. Now, so this becomes the adopted language for the Hebrews. Around this same time, actually just 4 years after the construction of the temple, around this same time is a date for the founding of the city of Rome itself. Alba Longa, remember, has been there for now well over 150 years, closer to 200 years. And now the city of Rome has been founded. Well, who founded the city of Rome? Of course, the old legend was that it was two brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were lost by their mother, raised in the forest by a she-wolf, and the two of them grow up, and Romulus and Remus found the city of Rome. In a jealous fit, Romulus throws his brother off the walls of Rome and kills him, and so then takes the name for himself. The city, names the city after himself, Rome, after Romulus, which is nice because had his other brother won, the city would have been called Rheims, and nobody wants that. So after the founding of Rome, it's going to be quite a long time before they're really much of a power. They begin to grow, and they, through a series of wars, they begin picking fights with the neighboring city-states, and they'll eventually start spreading their power throughout central Italy, and eventually defeat the Etruscans and basically conquer all of Italy. But that won't be enough for them, and they're going to start looking elsewhere, of course. Around the same time, King Thursippus of Athens has passed away after 41 years of rule, and his son will then take over after him. So we've had kind of a long line of Athenian kings at this point, but remember, they're not the absolute rulers that they had been for a long time. The king of the Chow dynasty passes away, and then in 946, not kidding you, his name is King Gong. King Gong becomes the ruler of the Chow dynasty. Again, the Chows will last for another, goodness, 700 years almost. In Egypt, at the same time, the last king of the 21st dynasty dies, and Shoshank I will succeed him, establishing the 22nd dynasty. Now, in 935, not only has King Gong of the Chows passed away, but so has Tiglath-Pileser II of the Assyrians. What will come after that is a much more outward-looking Assyria, who will begin to threaten the borders of people, well, like Israel. Now, around this same time, and we can look at the next image, in 920 BC, that was the one of the divided kingdom. In 926 BC, we see the split of Israel, the unified kingdom under Saul and David and Solomon, is now passed on to Rehoboam. And Rehoboam is arrogant, he's prideful, he doesn't listen to the advisors of his father Solomon. In fact, his youthful advisors, if you read in the books of the Kings, his youthful advisors tell him, tell the people that you have more power in your little finger than your father Solomon had in his whole body. Now, we always think of Solomon as the great king, the wise king, And sure, that's all true, but Solomon also had a bit of a dark side, we find out. And that is, he had established forced labor policies, especially in the building of his temple, where the tribes were all supposed to send workers towards the building of this. Now, the thing is that the folks were not all that jacked up about being centralized with a government in Jerusalem. David liked the idea, Solomon liked the idea, but before they had always had different shrine sites. In Shechem, for example, in Bethel, in Beersheba, and other places like that, there were different places where people could go to worship. Now, in Solomon's time, everyone's supposed to be coming to Jerusalem for all of the great ceremonies. And the 10 tribes in the north aren't really crazy about that. What they had signed on for was a confederation, more or less, under a single ruler, but they had no idea at all about signing on for a dynastic kingdom like in Egypt. They didn't want to be like Egypt. Sure, they wound up having a king like Egypt or Assyria or Babylon, but they don't want it to be dynastic. Just because Solomon is David's son didn't necessarily mean that they wanted Solomon as their king. And yet, that's who they've got. So the people wind up revolting. The 10 tribes of the north wind up breaking away and establishing their capital. You see where the star in the kingdom of Israel is. Their capital is in Samaria. And the southern capital, which is now just left to 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, those are the 2 tribes of the south. Now, when you look on that map, you can see where the Assyrian Empire is in the upper right-hand corner. They're not that close to Judah, but they are knocking on heaven's door for the kingdom of Assyria, for the kingdom of Israel. The kingdom of Damascus is a little bit of a buffer zone, and that's why we wind up reading in the book of the Kings that the king of Israel and the king of Damascus, Ben-Hadad II, actually formed a coalition in order to fight against the Assyrians. The Assyrians play heavily in the books of the Kings and the Chronicles. Well, so now what happens is that the 10 tribes of the north start looking for someone else. And the one they like is a guy named Jeroboam. So in the kingdom of Judah, the south, it's King Rehoboam. In the kingdom of the north, Israel, it's Jeroboam. So now these are 2 divided kingdoms. They're related by language. They're certainly related by religion, but politically and commercially, they start looking in their own directions, looking out for their own best interests. So now, at this same time, way over in Greece, the kingdom of Sparta. Remember, I showed you that. Sparta has been developed, or what I should say, founded. Now, so with Jeroboam in the north, Rehoboam in the south, Sparta has now been founded. The kingdom of Ethiopia develops, which is way down. I showed you where that was, the Horn of Africa, the eastern Horn of Africa. And the guy who establishes the kingdom of Ethiopia is named Menelik the First. And according to his history, according to his biography, he was the son of Solomon and Sheba. Yep. And so forever, the kings of Ethiopia considered themselves to be the heirs of Solomon. In fact, you remember in the 20th century, the emperor Haile Selassie considered himself to be the last descendant of King Solomon. So now, in over in 912. Now, Menelik founds the Ethiopian kingdom in 920. In 912, Adad-nirari II becomes the king of Assyria, and he begins his first moves against the kingdom of Damascus that we saw on the map. In 911, King Abijah of Judah passes away, and we're still following basically a Davidic line. They are the descendants of King David. Judah wants that. The North Kingdom doesn't. Now, a funny thing that around this same time, Abijah dies in 911. The next year in 910, Kamil Zashi assassinates a king named King Baraksal in the Gudayi dynasty down in the southernmost point of Africa. It was called the Kingdom of Punt, like punting a football. The Kingdom of Punt was actually 2,000 years old when Baraksal is assassinated. 2,000 years old. And when Kamil Zashi assassinates him, it is an end to that kingdom. Now, we think that nothing is going on in Africa. The way that we're taught history in school, sure, we'll acknowledge that something was happening in China. All right, we'll grudgingly admit something's happening in India. But in the south part of Africa, there was a flourishing kingdom with great architecture, with an amazing culture, and it passes away here 910 BC, and the Romans don't know about it, the Greeks don't know about it, and if they don't know about it, then nobody in Europe cares, basically. So the next year, King Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, dies and is succeeded by his son Nadab. Now, once again, the Israelites had said we don't want a dynastic king, and yet that's exactly what they do again. After Jeroboam, it's his son, and after Nadab, his son. So yeah, doesn't matter what you want, it's what Santa Claus brings you. If we'll look at the next image, we'll look at India, and this is in the 900s BC. We'll see the beginning of what we call Vedic India. Vedic India is during the time of the writing of the Hebrew scriptures called the Vedas. The very first Veda we were talking about, we mentioned it last time, was called the Rig Veda, which is actually the oldest religious text in the world. It came from Hinduism. Now, if you'll look at the map there, in the northern part of India, you'll see the Indo-European speaking peoples. Those are the Aryans, the one who had come most recently from Persia, before that from Central Europe. When we think about in World War II and the Nazis and they're wanting an Aryan race, these guys are part of that. So the cultural Aryans are still in India, but they're rarely blonde-haired and blue-eyed. No, because they had assimilated with the Dravidian folks who are farther down in the south, who will kind of remain kind of in a stone age for quite some time. But during this period, during the 900s, in Vedic India, they began writing these Vedas, and most especially a guy named Yajnavalkya writes the Shatapatha Brahmana, in which he describes the motions of the sun and the moon, and he's right. Before Copernicus, I mean millennia before Copernicus, he's got it called. Vaishnavalkya says, no, the sun does not go around us, we go around it, and the moon goes around us. Pretty sophisticated stuff for a guy in the 900s BC. So, Indian astronomy is alive and well, and it will take the West another 2,000 years to catch up. Well, 2,500 years to catch up with him, with what was already being done in India. Um, Back over in Italy, the Villanova culture begins to emerge in northern Italy. And at the same time, we're talking about 900 BC, in Central America, the Olmecs are beginning to, I had an image and I think I forgot to, let me have a quick look. Sorry. Nope. Anyway, I had a nice picture of an Olmec pyramid that was built around this time. So 900 becomes kind of a big deal. In 900, you've got Vajnavalkya, who writing the Shatapatha Brahmana, and then you've got the rising of the Villanova culture in the north of Italy. The Olmecs in Central America are building pyramids, for crying out loud. Okay, not as as far back as the Egyptians did, but these are the ones that you've seen that have they're not like triangular, not a point at the top. They've got like a little house on the top, or a square box on the top, which was a shrine site. But at the same time, 900, you have, there it is. I did give it to you. All right. So you've got those steps, and of course the steps, if I remember correct, there's something like 365 steps. Yep. And then the big steps, there was a number of those. I can't remember what that number was associated with. But anyway, up top then is the priest would ascend way up those steps. And yeah, and you can see for scale that you can see people standing by that bump. There you go. Standing there so that each one of those is the height of a person. But you might have a little forced perspective going on here because they're actually a little closer to the camera than they are to the pyramid itself. So they might be a little bit shorter than that. Anyway, this is what they were building in the Olmec. We always think of that temple, and it's Chichen Itza is actually where that is. We always think of that as a Mayan temple or an Aztec temple. It's not. It is the Olmecs who preceded both of those cultures. So at the same time, in 900, and it's funny that when we look at history, there are certain periods where a lot of things are happening at the same time. 900 happens to be one of those times. Not only do we have the Olmecs and the Villanova culture and the Vedic India, but we have the foundation of Sri Lanka, which is off the southern southeastern tip of India. It was called Ceylon at one time, but Sri Lanka. The same time, there are certain relics that have been found from the Tamil Nadu culture, and the Tamils, remember, that's one of the languages, one of the two languages of Sri Lanka. Many dialects, but these are there are two major languages. And the Tamils were an indigenous group, an ethnic group, and you might have read over the last decade, well, the previous decade, where there was the fight for Sri Lanka included a group called the Tamil Tigers. And the Tamil Tigers were those who were desperately trying to reestablish Tamil superiority or dominance in, and this is how long the Tamils have been going on there. So also 900, we have the Kingdom of Kush established. The Kingdom of Kush will be the Ethiopian kingdom, of course. We already have a king. We've had a king for several decades by this point, but now this kingdom begins expanding out. Same time, 900 BC, we have the establishment of a settlement in Plymouth, England. It dates back to 900, and it is believed that this was established by ancient Gauls or Celts even, who have come from Asia Minor here's a word connection. In Asia Minor, Paul writes a letter to the Galatians, right? Galatians. The Gauls are actually ethnically from that region. And from that region, they migrated across Greece and Macedonia, across what would be called Yugoslavia today, Albania, across Switzerland, across France, and finally over to England. And there, the ancient Gauls will become the Celts and will establish a powerful kingdom there, an amazing culture there, until you wind up having the Romans come and try to take it all away. So that moves us into the 9th century, and I'm going to try to move through the 800s pretty quick. In the I'm just going to do it by decades. In the 890s, you have the King Xiao of the Chao dynasty passes away, and King Yi of the Chao becomes the next king after him. And under King Yi will be a large expansion of like terracotta works, and not those thousands of soldiers that you might be familiar with, but pottery begins to move into a whole different phase during his reign. It's not him who does it, it's just during his reign. Over in Athens, Megacles dies after a 30-year reign. His son Diogenetus becomes the next king. And now Assyria is growing even more. You're hearing me talk about Assyria a lot because next time when we talk about the era of the prophets, it's the Assyrians and the Babylonians who are going to draw the most attention. So all along now, we've watched kind of a growth of Assyrian interests in the Middle East. Same decade, city of Naples is established in Italy. They call it Napoli. And also during the same time, oh, I have an image for this one. We have it's called the Brahmana period of the Vedic Sanskrit language. Obviously, you see how much I like to study language because I keep showing you all that. This is what Vedic Sanskrit looks like. Sanskrit is actually a part of the Indo-European family of languages. And if you look at this book, this is a whole book right there. You see the string tied around it. That's because in India, to this day, they will have their sacred text as a page about this size, and really, this is much larger than what it looks like in person. It is probably no more than about 3 inches tall and about probably 10 inches long, 9 or 10. And so this is a page. You want to read page 2, you flip it over on top, and on the underneath this page will be another page. And so you have to keep, and it's not bound by thread, it's not bound by glue, it is loose. All the pages are loose. And if you'll notice, there is no number on that page. So if you drop your book, you better know the book pretty well because you got to put it back together. But these are the sacred writings, and so you don't find, little Chuck Peterson reading his sacred texts in his house. It's going to be in the temples where you find that. So in the 880s now, we have new kings in Egypt, and here comes a good name. Ashur-Nisarpal becomes the second, succeeds his father as the king of Assyria. Ashur-Nisarpal will actually move against the Hittites farther north in Asia Minor, and he'll also make moves against the kingdom of where Babylon is. It's not really the Babylonian kingdom anymore. but it is certainly a move against Babylon. Ashurnasirpal II. There's a good one. I'm going to quiz you on that one. In 879, in the 870s, King Yi of the Chal dies, and and just to make things interesting, his son is King Li. King Yi, then King Li, becomes the leader, and in Egypt, the 22nd dynasty is beginning its decline, but in the same decade is the coming of a new king in Israel. His name is Ahab, technically Ahab. His wife, you may remember her, is Jezebel. Jezebel is actually a princess from the Phoenician kingdom. She's not Philistine, as a lot of times people had thought. No, the Philistines, if you'll remember that map, was farther down with the cities of Ashkelon, Ekron, Ashdod, Gath, Gaza, all those. This is farther north in the three principal cities of Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, Tyre. That is the kingdom of Phoenicia. These people were already sailing all over the Mediterranean. In fact, some have suggested that they may have made it to the New World sometime during this time. We always think of it being, what's his name, Vasco da Gama, who had sailed around the southern tip of Africa and made it to India. In the last century, they found a Phoenician ship about 50 miles off the coast of India. So the Phoenicians were making the trip, again, 2 centuries before, over 2 centuries before Vasco da Gama got there. So Jezebel is the princess whose father is the king of Tyre, and she comes over and brings her worship with her. She is not a devotee of Yahweh. No, she is a follower of Baal Melkart. We think of, when we read the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, especially in the Kings, we read a lot about the god Baal, but actually that's not referring to one. Baal just means Lord, and usually there was a second name attached to it, like in Jezebel's case, Baal Melkart, which meant he was the Lord of the dead. So we have this pretty dark, sinister cult of death now in the palace at Samaria, where King Ahab is. It's, of course, during this time that the prophet Elijah begins making noise against the prophets of the plural of Baal is Baalim. I am always is plural in Hebrew. And so these priests are not all priests of just one Baal cult. They are priests of the Baalim, all of them. And of course, you know, we know the stories about Elijah, and he's threatened with murder. Jezebel wants to get rid of him, and Jezebel brings along this cult with her, and they begin to treat the Yahweh worshipers, Jehovah worshipers, as kind of like country bumpkins. That they're just, you know, they're just not that sophisticated. And of course, Elijah is out to prove them wrong. In the end, Ahab will be killed in battle against who? The Assyrians. And in one of the great stories of the Hebrew Bible, they consult the prophets. The king of Damascus consults with Ahab and said, "We need to check out some of your prophets." Well, the Baalim don't really have any prophets, and so they got to go to the Yahwists. And the prophets of Israel are all giving them, you know, good prophecies. Oh, you're going to do well. You're going to do so great. It's going to be great. It's going to be huge. You're going to do so well against the Assyrians. And so Ben-Hadad II says, not sure I trust these guys. Do you got anybody else? He goes, well, I got a guy who basically hates me. He's always talking trash. Every time I go to him, he tells me something bad's going to happen. And he goes, Ben-Hadad says, let's go talk to him. Well, they're talking about a prophet named Micaiah, son of Emlah, Micaiah ben Emlah. Here is one of the oddest episodes of the whole Hebrew Bible. The scene kind of shifts to the heavenly throne room, and God says to the angels around him and the spirits around him, and he goes, you know what we need? We need a lying spirit. We need somebody to go down and speak a lie to Micaiah ben Emlah so that he can give it to the king. And some angel, I don't know his name, says, I'll do it. And so Yahweh sends this angel to go down to Micaiah ben Emlah. And when Ahab and Ben-Hadad II get there, and he goes, yep, you're all going to be fine. Everything's going to do well. Spirit apparently departs. And Ahab goes, wait a minute, you've never told me anything good. and Micaiah goes, yeah, you're right, you're going to die. So for some brief moment there, God's got his prophet lying to the king. Well, sure enough, off they go. Both of them are killed in battle. And then in a horror story, the Assyrians come into Samaria and they wind up taking the kingdom. And Jezebel is, remember, thrown from the balcony and splatters on the stones below where the dogs consume her. Pretty strange stuff. Now, that was all in fulfillment of the prophet's prophecy at that time. But this is the first time that the Assyrians really make a hard move into the north kingdom, and Ahab and Jezebel and their child all pay the price for it. Now, only 2 years after that, and that's about 874, no, it's exactly 874 BC, and 872, over in India, a guy named Tarshvanatha establishes the religion of Jainism. Jains. That's Jainism. Some people call it Jains, but whichever. And Jainism is this very passive, it's a religion that still exists today in India. And the motto or the slogan, the underlying principle of Jainism is do no injury. To that extent, even today, you can tell a Jain who's walking down, Main Street in India, and they'll walk with a gentle broom sweeping their way in front of them so that they don't step on a bug. They will actually use cheesecloth and strain everything they drink because they're afraid of any kind of microbes. They don't want to hurt anything. In fact, they wind up being accounted as the most successful bankers in India because the people know they've taken a vow not to do any injury. It doesn't mean just harm. It could be economic injury. It could be any kind of injury. That all begins way back here, around the same time that we see the development of the prophets in Israel and in Judah. We're seeing the beginning of a whole other religion in India as well. Now, same time as that, if I could have the next picture, Pastor, the big great temple of Luxor, actually it's the temple of Karnak in Luxor, is I might have forgot it. Oh well, there was a massive temple there in Luxor, Egypt, and it wound up being flooded by an exceptionally high flood from the Nile. The Nile floods every year. And of course, that's one of the first things you learn in, your Western Civ classes is about, that's why they developed a calendar. That's why, the irrigation develops because of this flooding that will allow cultivation of the land along both sides, both banks of the Nile. There it is. I probably had it numbered pretty off. Huge temple complex, and all of that had been, I'm not saying it was covered with waters, but certainly it was flooded so that nobody could get in there. And yeah, the whole massive complex there wound up being underwater around this same time. The Egyptians didn't like it. The Egyptians thought that this was a sign from their gods, and so from that time on, the Egyptians are pretty careful about where they start building stuff. But they'll never build anything like this complex ever again. In the next century, we wind up having the Assyrians expanding their empire, and it's becoming now the Assyrian Empire. And in the next one, the next picture, around the same time, the kingdom of Urartu is unified into what would then become Assyria. There you go. Right there in, I didn't mean that condescendingly when I said there you go. I was happy that it was, if you'll look there to the upper left, it is, that's the Black Sea, and to your right is the Caspian Sea. And so straight north is the Caucasus Mountains that will lead into Russia, and actually around here is what will eventually become the Kingdom of Armenia. And again, another kingdom that we don't know a whole lot about, or let me say, are not taught a lot about, but this becomes an incredibly important place centuries down the road. The Armenians are an incredibly independent people, and just to jump ahead several centuries, when Christianity spreads, this becomes a powerhouse of Christian activity. And in fact, when the Muslim invaders will get there much later, they'll come and conquer, then called Armenia. And one of the things that they do is that they will put the sword to the throats of the Armenian people and say, do you reject Christ? Now, if they shake their head no, it cuts their throat. No, sorry. Do you accept Islam? If they shake their head no, it cuts their throat. And right there, a new cultural oddity takes place. That from at that moment, if you ask someone in Armenia a yes or no question and they nod their head, it means no. If they shake their head, it means yes. So when they've got the sword to their throat, do you accept Islam and the Prophet Muhammad? They nodded their head. They meant no, but that's not what the invaders thought. A good story. So the in the next decade, Aramu becomes the king of Urartu and begins to establish this great kingdom right in there. Funny thing is that he is not that much of he's not a conqueror. He's not one who is interested in acquisition. He just wants to build this land for these people. And so he never goes into the rest of Asia Minor. He never goes into what we would call Russia. He becomes a parent over the people. Same time, another great name in Assyria, Shalmaneser III. Shalmaneser III begins this massive invasion, and he even reached all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, when you read the tablets Shalmaneser's military campaigns that he said that when they had finished, they washed their spears in the sea. Holy smokes. So now Shalmaneser is a step up even from Ashurnasirpal II, and it's only going to get worse from there. More and more, they begin training their heirs as generals more than politicians, which is why after the fall of Assyria, there's not a whole lot in the way of architecture or literature or anything like that. The Assyrians were first and foremost conquerors, and Shalmaneser III will certainly take hold of that. Egypt is still in its 22nd dynasty, and in the 850s, or actually 850, is the beginning of the forgot what they called it, the Chosin culture in what is now Korea. It starts to develop distinctive pottery and even begins distinctive writing, mostly because they've been under the thumb of China for so long. They're looking to find some other alphabet for them to be for them to use. During the 840s, Shalmaneser has devastated the kingdom of Damascus, whereas he had certainly, his father had defeated Ben-Hadad II and Ahab. Now it's just totally under the thumb of the Assyrians. And around the same time, if we can go to the Chinese writing that you had on there, Pastor, it's the this was the it was called the Records of the Grand Historian. There you go. And the Records of the Grand Historian regards 841 as being the first year of annual dating. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but we always think of, when we think of a time, we think of, 1975, 19 whatever, 2020. But way back, and it wasn't all that long ago, okay, a couple of thousand years ago, but that's not long in history. They would simply refer to an event. Okay, remember in, what is it, Isaiah chapter 6, in the year that King Uzziah died. All right, that was how they numbered the time, which is why it was always a joke. If you find a coin that says 40 BC, how do you know it's a fake? Of course. So there's no such dating except in China. That China is beginning to starting their dating in 841 BC, the first of annual consecutive dating in Chinese history, or really anywhere. Around the same time, a new dynasty emerges in Nepal. Think of Nepal, where you think of like Mount Everest, all that. And it's the first dynasty, the Gopala dynasty, is established there in Nepal during this time. Okay, so Shalmaneser III is continuing his conquest. Elijah has gone away on the flaming chariot, and Elisha, of course, takes his place. Elisha will become a prophet not only for Judaism, but he winds up showing up in Christian literature. He winds up showing up in the Quran. So Elisha is one of those first one who is a prophet for Judaism and Christianity, and for Islam as well, appearing in all three texts: the Hebrew Bible, the Christian New Testament, and the Quran. In that decade, the 830s, civil war breaks out in Egypt, and things start taking a pretty ugly turn there. But at the same time, way over in North Africa, a settlement near the city of Carthage is founded by the Phoenicians. Remember the Phoenicians, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. That's where Jezebel came from. Now they established a trading settlement over there near Carthage, near it. Let's see, in the 820s, Shalmaneser will finally die, thank God. He is succeeded by his son Shamsi-Adad the fifth, and a new king will come to the throne in Tyre. Tyre, the Phoenicians are not a unified country; they're city-states. So that Byblos and Sidon and Tyre are technically independent of each other, but they come together for trade and military purposes as well. The 23rd dynasty will begin in the 810s, and also in 810, the next image, Pastor, is the founding of Carthage. Carthage is, remember I told you just a second ago about there was a settlement near there, but there in Carthage is going to be the other major city of the Mediterranean, and they will establish such power that Rome and Carthage will fight 3 wars with each other, called the Punic Wars. It's during that time that Carthage will have their great general named Hannibal. The Romans will fight desperately against them, and Rome will beat them all 3 times, but every time Carthage comes back, except for the 3rd time. But that won't be until the 100s BC. So to wrap up where we are by the turn of the century at 800, Adad Nirari is the king of Assyria and is looking to move on the North Kingdom of Israel. We have the 23rd dynasty in Egypt. We have Etruscan civilization that is in full power in Italy at that moment. And also, it's the beginning of the Iron Age in Central Europe and a spread of Celtic and Gallic culture. Even the beginning of a Proto-Celtic language. And the Celtic language will have a huge impact in the British Isles. In fact, in Ireland, the language of Gaelic is built on that. But when it's all over, and also at the same time, before I forget, the Adena culture has begun to develop in Ohio, in North America. And that will be a huge culture that is left behind a lot of artifacts that are still interesting, to college students who go out on archaeological digs on the weekend from Ohio State. But at this time, where we leave them off is that Assyria is looking with ravenous eyes at the kingdom of Israel in the north. And next time is when we will see the emergence of the prophets that we know, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, all the rest of those. And we'll see kingdoms and empires come and go. The Assyrians will come and go. The Babylonians will come after them. The Egyptians will never be what they were, what we were talking about last time. Now the focus of power, the locus of power, has moved to Assyria and Babylonia, and then comes the Persians, and after them, the Greeks. But that'll be the last thing we talk about.